Nobody made a documentary about them. There's no Netflix series built around their nostalgia, no trend piece declaring they're ruining the housing market. No one is particularly worried about them. No one is particularly arguing about them. And somehow, that's the most Gen X thing you could say about Gen X. They grew up being ignored. And somewhere along the way, they got used to it. We're living through the loudest intergenerational conversation in modern history. Boomers built the world. Millennials inherited the mess. Gen Z is burning the blueprint. Every generation gets its moment, its reckoning, its reassessment, except one. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980. 5 million people in the United States alone, sandwiched between the most analyzed generation in history and the most talked about generation in history. Forgotten in the middle, again. But here's what most people miss. That forgetting didn't just happen to Gen X, it was their whole childhood. And it produced something psychologically fascinating, a kind of human being the world hadn't quite seen before. It's 1978, you're 9 years old, school ends at 3 in the afternoon, your mom works until 6, sometimes your dad is there, sometimes he isn't, because your parents split 2 years ago, which wasn't unusual because half your friends' parents had split too. You come home to an empty house. You let yourself in with the key you wear on a string around your neck. You make yourself a snack. You watch TV. You figure it out. Nobody asks how your day was. Not because nobody loves you, but because everyone is busy surviving. That key around your neck wasn't just a house key. It was the first lesson. Take care of yourself. The world will not wait. This was the defining texture of a Gen X childhood. Researchers had a name for it: the latchkey generation. A study published in the Journal of Youth and Adolescence found that by the mid-1980s, as many as 7 million American children were regularly supervising themselves after school, coming home to empty houses, navigating boredom and loneliness with no adult present. 7 million children, alone, every afternoon. And here's the thing about being alone at 9 years old: you don't sit around contemplating the weight of it. You just do. You adapt. You solve small problems because there's no one else to solve them for you. But the real reason this psychology runs so deep goes beyond the empty house. Gen X also grew up inside a culture in genuine crisis. The divorce rate in America peaked in 1979, higher than it had ever been in recorded history. Inflation hit 14%. The Cold War wasn't an abstraction. It was a real thing your school did drills for. The news was bleak. Adults were anxious. The institutions that were supposed to be stable, marriage, government, the economy, were visibly cracking at the seams. And children absorb all of that. They don't have the words for it. But they feel it in the air at the dinner table. They feel it when a parent comes home tired, in a way that has nothing to do with a long day. They were the kids of the Reaganomics era, told everything was fine, while watching everything quietly fall apart. So what does that kind of childhood actually do to a developing brain? When a child routinely navigates challenges without adult help, they build something psychologists call internal locus of control, the deep, embodied belief that their actions cause outcomes. That effort matters, that they are the agent in their own story, not the passenger. In plain language, they learned that if something needed doing, they had to do it. And that lesson got encoded so early and so repeatedly that it became identity. But here's where it gets complicated. Because the same environment that built that self-reliance also built something else. A kind of emotional self-sufficiency that looks, from the outside, a lot like not needing anyone. Gen Zers learned very young that expressing need was often pointless. Adults were busy. The culture wasn't listening, so you processed things privately. You figured out what you felt, the same way you figured out what to make for dinner, alone, quietly, without making a big thing of it. A study published in the American Sociological Review found that Gen X showed measurably higher rates of self-reliance as a core personal value than any preceding generation, not out of philosophy, but out of necessity. It wasn't a belief they chose. It was a reflex they earned. That emotional distance isn't coldness, it's what survival looked like for them. And here's the contradiction at the center of all of it. Gen X is arguably the most psychologically self-aware generation alive, and one of the least likely to talk about it. They came of age just as therapy culture was becoming mainstream. They watched their parents' marriages dissolve in real time. They saw up close what repressed emotion looked like as a lifestyle. And then they locked most of theirs in a box and got on with it anyway. They'll read a book about attachment theory and then ghost their therapist. They'll recognize a trauma response in real time and still not mention it to anyone. They understand the language of emotional intelligence, they just refuse to perform it. They helped build the emotional vocabulary that generations after them now use fluently, and they mostly don't use it themselves. So what does all of this actually create in a person? Not a broken one, not a damaged one. Something more interesting than that. Watch a Gen Xer in a workplace meeting. They're the one who has heard this same conversation 3 times under 3 different names. They were there for quality circles in the 80s, synergy in the 90s, disruption in the 2000s, psychological safety now. They don't roll their eyes, not visibly, they just wait. They've learned that institutional enthusiasm has a half-life. They are, by almost every measure, the most adaptable employees in the workforce. Not because they love change, but because they've stopped being surprised by it. In relationships, they show love through action, not declaration. They'll fix your car at 10 at night. They'll quietly research your symptoms and leave the article on your desk. They'll handle the logistics of your crisis without being asked, and then deflect when you try to thank them. Because asking for acknowledgement still feels vaguely dangerous, like pressing on a bruise they forgot they had. And this is what most people miss when they try to understand them. As parents, they lean towards something developmental psychologists call authoritative parenting, warm but boundaried, emotionally available but not hovering. They are, consciously or not, trying to give their children something they didn't always have: presence. But they're also allergic to softness as performance. There's a difference between being there and making a whole thing about being there. Gen X parents know the difference. They built the internet. They wrote the early code. They created the first blogs. And they are now among the most skeptical users of social media alive. They made the machine. They don't entirely trust it. Here's what I keep coming back to. Every generation gets defined by what happened to them. But Gen X got defined, in large part, by what didn't happen. The parent who wasn't home, the safety net that wasn't there, the cultural moment that never quite came with their name on it, and what they built out of that absence is worth sitting with. Not because they had it harder, not to rank suffering or crown a winner, but because there's something quietly profound about a generation that learned, before they were old enough to articulate it, that waiting to be rescued was a kind of trap. They are not the loudest generation. They are not the most celebrated. They are not particularly interested in being either. They just keep showing up. Key around the neck, door unlocked, getting on with it, and maybe, when the noise finally dies down, that's its own kind of grace. If this made you think about someone you know, or someone you are, subscribe. There's more of this kind of work here every week.